We'll begin here as we begin each war with some historical facts and a little bit of context before we move more directly into the aspects of American mythos that were developed, supported, shaped, and challenged during this era. So the Mexican American War takes place between 1846 and 1848. Um, the reason, pretty unambiguously, is territorial expansion. This was an absolute land grab. That's what it was, and it was really the martial expression in a lot of ways of manifest destiny, a kind of doctrine, American doctrine that we will come back to in just a moment. In this war, we're not liberating anybody, um, though there were some pretty disingenuous arguments to that effect made for that cause. Mexico had already outlawed slavery conditionally in 1829. And that really set off Texas slaveholders. There were folks in Texas who found that to put them in a place of illegality they didn't think they should be in. So, a little background: in 1836, Texas broke from Mexico to become an independent nation, the Texas Republic. Um, Partly due to these questions of slavery, due to other things as well. But from 1836 to 1845, Texas was an independent nation, the Republic of Texas, in which, according to the Constitution of which, slavery was legal. So this was a major component of why it is that Texas chose to do what it did. Now, Mexico never accepted that independence, always saw Texas as a province in rebellion. And in 1845, the United States annexed Texas as a new state, annexed the Republic of Texas as a new state within the Union. Now, Texans like to remind the nation that Texas was the only state to enter the Union as an independent republic, and occasionally that leads to a kind of touting of their right to ultimately secede at any point. And there are secessionist movements still today in Texas. They really gained a foothold in the late 20th century that they hadn't seen for some time before. A tourism and ad campaign that started in the 90s played on this. Texas, it's like a whole other country, and this shows up it's trademarked. It shows up in all kinds of different forms, and you still see it today. In fact, the right to secession was pretty roundly rejected by the Civil War, and the Supreme Court has made plain that states have no secession rights from constitutional oversight. That this is because states, as states, are themselves created in some ways by the Constitution, and that's a recent opinion. Late 20th century, Justice Scalia made that really clear. All a bit of an aside, but it does point to some of the complexities at play within Texas, which ended up leading to the Mexican-American War, which itself then led to the Civil War in a lot of ways. So another thing that points at this is the Six Flags, which many of you who grew up in California know, or who grew up in Texas know as an amusement park, as roller coasters and rides. But Six Flags did originate in Texas as Six Flags Over Texas because, in fact, there have been Six Flags Over Texas, and you can see them listed here. There was Spain, France, back to Spain, Mexico, Texas as a republic, and that has been taken over as the state flag. And then Texas in Confederacy. Texas did join the Confederacy over slavery. That was the issue upon which they stood. And they had their own flag in that. And then Texas in the United States, which is to the present. But again, Texas as a republic, that flag remains the state flag, so still remains in use. The independent republic, back to the war. The independent Republic of Texas always had border problems. Never controlled the whole. They never controlled the entirety of the territory that they claimed. Mexico continued to control a large swath, and all the while Mexico claimed the entire territory as Mexican, while it controlled a large swath to the west. So when the U.S. annexed the republic as a state, Mexico didn't agree that the republic had the right to enter such an agreement. And that was a huge part of the problem. The U.S. in some ways, the argument would go, the U.S. in some ways really tried to make a bureaucratic point out of what was an act of war. So in January 1846, thinking it likely that Mexico would not look kindly upon the U.S. annexation of territory they believed to be their own, then President Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move in with his troops, and that's who you see here on horseback, lionized in many similar portraits. Battles ensued. A war was declared on May 13th, 1846. So this is one of those moments, as we've seen, especially in the last 30 or so years, of real sort of preemptory defense. It's questionable at best, but General Zachary Taylor moved in. Public response was mixed. We saw in journalist John O'Sullivan, pictured here with the most popular imagistic representation of the idea next to him, we saw in journalist O'Sullivan the introduction of the phrase manifest destiny. He was a true believer in the war and in its just cause, and as incidentally was Walt Whitman, whom we did not read, but might surprise some folks. But I want to pause a minute on this concept, which gained immediate traction and which continues to enjoy cultural currency today. Manifest destiny, John O'Sullivan introduces in 1845 in the article you read an excerpt from. This famous painting to the right is by John Gast, and it comes later. It's 1872, but it's almost always overlaid on the concept of, or used as an imagistic representation of, the concept of manifest destiny. It's itself called American Progress. He writes, O'Sullivan writes in his article, with a great disdain for any notion, for any notion that that any other nation should be allowed to interfere in the American project. He calls it, and he's referring most explicitly to Mexico very clearly here, but he calls it a hostile interference. This interference seeks to limit, quote, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. It's not surprising, looking at America today, that this concept really did take off. Looking at the America of the Revolutionary era and forward, this was a concept that really rooted itself in a providential notion, in America as a chosen nation with a destiny to fulfill. And then the idea behind manifest destiny is that really sea to shining sea, that if God didn't want the American colonialists as a nation state to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific, well then God would not have put two oceans on either side of a really clearly geographically delineated territory. So our destiny was manifest. It was apparent. It was real physically, in that there was an ocean on one side and an ocean on the other. And so patently we are called upon as a national body to populate and rule over this entire region. That's the idea. O'Sullivan sees Texas and he says California is next. It's inevitable. And this is like a key component of his argument. It's not that Texas is going to pave the way for people to really intentionally and craftily get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's that it's inevitable to O'Sullivan. Without agency or responsibility, the natural flow of events, the spontaneous working out of principles, right? That this was just the way that the evolutionary proceedings of human development were going to lead this nation. It was an unsigned article in the Democratic Review. It's worth knowing he didn't sign his name to it. Really a call to and a justification for a particularly American form of imperialism, a form that understood itself in providential terms and really long had. So we can go back to 1630. John Winthrop, who was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, writes famously, many of you will have seen this, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into a covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. Follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. We shall be seen as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people upon us." And we see that city upon a hill image, again, which we've seen before. And here we have that providential notion, right? That God gave us this land and that it's supposed to be inherited by Euro-Americans, or mostly in this vision, a very British or Anglophile version of that, and that it's a divine calling. We couldn't avoid it if we tried. It is our destiny. That's how this narrative runs, and undergirding it is this sense that you see here on the Micah precept, right? That you do justly, you love mercy, you do justly, you love mercy, you walk humbly with your God, right? And And so throughout the development of the American exceptionalism that really plays out martially and geographically in Manifest Destiny, but is there in 1630 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony explicitly, undergirding it all is this self-congratulatory notion that what we're doing is just and true and humble and merciful and right. And if you say that often enough, then the facts of war are really just tools through which to manifest these ideals. But in some visions, O'Sullivan among them, the atrocities of war didn't in any way stand up to contradict the justice, mercy, and humility that are called for and self-congratulated in the American populace here. That's a disconnect. It's an enormous disconnect that does run throughout history. So moving forward, jumping into the 19th century, a couple hundred years later, you've got Lyman Beecher, who's an evangelistic preacher of what are known as the Great Awakenings. He's like this, what most historians agree is the Second Great Awakening. It's, that's its own history and its own complicated conversation. But through these awakenings, which periodically happen in America, and it's part of the American inheritance that we see these, America would be the site of the millennium, which is a biblical term. It doesn't just mean 1,000 years, right? Which we know it to mean, the millennium, right? The turn of the millennium. But within the biblical text of Revelation, it's very clearly articulated as 1,000-year reign of peace and justice. That, there would be end times. And the question is whether the end times, the second coming of Jesus, would come before this 1,000-year reign of peace and justice, and all of the righteous would be raptured up to heaven, and all of the unrighteous would be burned and tortured in various ways for their otherness, or whether or not the end times would come after the 1,000-year reign of peace and justice. That is to say, if people really need it, if it's our job as humans on this world, and in this vision as Christians, who want the second coming of Jesus actively, that's something that's a good thing. You want that. In order to make it happen, you really have to institute 1,000 years of peace and justice. So in the 19th century, the 1800s, a lot of what happened in America through this revivalistic impulse of what are known as awakenings is that you see a real optimistic trend towards social betterment, social, projects of what were understood to be social justice. So abolition was part of this, literacy was part of this, temperance movements were part of this, education, public education came around in the year 1830. And they were known as common schools at first, but all of this was understood as the good works that would lead to the justice that would bring Jesus and this second coming towards which we looked. But anyway, that's all a bit of background. America for Lyman Beecher, an evangelistic preacher. He was an evangelical preacher in the 19th century that really, in a lot of ways, is the model for the dominant religiosity of America today. Evangelical Christianity. He says, America is destined to lead the way in the moral and political emancipation of the world. That this was, again, a calling, providentially ordained. God was on our side. The enemy, all enemies, were therefore demonic. And this is that national psychological move that has allowed the American populace to go pretty smoothly from quotations of the biblical text that call for justice, mercy, and humility, emancipation, morals, all of this into warfare, right? Because God is on our side, and it's upon us to battle those demonic enemies. That snap happens very quickly. Formally, the United States was established not by 1630, but by 1830. Formally, this is a secular nation, but in reality, it's a deeply religious society moving through the eras as we've seen them. That's changing a little bit in the contemporary world, but we'll get there. This is what Donald Scott calls a creedal society, unified by doctrine rather than by geography, that it was unified in doctrine long before geographical bounds were ever established, and those geographical bounds, they just keep changing very quickly in the eras that we're looking at. The geography was just changing fast, and we'll see this carry through into the Civil War, so in the narrative especially. So at the end of Gettysburg, I'm jumping ahead now in time. Now we're in 1863. We're past the era of the Mexican-American War. We are well into the Civil War, but we see the same sentiment come up in the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It is for the living to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last true measure of devotion. that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. We will read this speech. This is a beautiful speech. Um, but what I use it for here, what I bring it up for here, is that it's a pretty clear articulation of the doctrine, in terms clearly conversant with manifest destiny, city upon the hill exceptionalism, and all of the sort of God on our side. We have a really important project that's providentially ordained that we're working towards. So all things are sort of justified. And I think back to Quinn, and they forgot that it was a story, right? And that seems to be part of what's going on here. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone agreed with the notion that, now jumping back from Lincoln to back to O'Sullivan, not everyone agreed that it was our manifest destiny. It was present before us, our calling to expand territorially into the lands owned by natives and then governed by the nation of Mexico. It was that not everyone agreed, and so we see Thoreau, whom we read. We see him enter the narrative. He spent a night in jail for refusing to pay his taxes because of this war, the Mexican-American War, and because of slavery. And I want to read you a few quotes out of the excerpt that we read, Civil Disobedience. It's longer than this. It's excellent. If you've not already read it, or if it's been a while since you read the essay on the duty of civil disobedience, unabridged, I really recommend it to you. Take a look back. We read a very short version, but I'm just going to highlight a couple quotes. He says, "I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it." And so he says this kind of self-awareness of the governed is big for Thoreau, that's part of it. That it's not just on the government. He's indicting the government enormously here, but it's not just on the government. It's also on citizens, on people. And by men, I'm going to just assume that he, of course, meant women too. It's on us to know what we want, to think about it, and to have a hand in its construction. This is from the next page. "How does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? What's the right way to behave? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also." And as I said, it was not just the Mexican-American War. That kind of lit the fire and moved him to act and to write, but he had long been against slavery, against the government that supported it. So, in other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation which was undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. What makes the duty the more urgent is the fact that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is the invading army. And here he refers to the Mexican-American War. "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly," says the quote on the page, on the screen, "the true place for a just man is in prison." And this, it's a little cartoony, but the legendary apocryphal exchange between Thoreau and Emerson I've put next to it because it does speak really well. It may or may not have happened, but it does speak really well to Thoreau's insistence that civil disobedience is a duty. It's a civic duty. It's required. He wasn't a proponent of violence. He didn't think that would work, and he also didn't think it was just. But he didn't think that that there was any justification for aligning oneself with or responding positively or obediently to a government that was itself fundamentally unjust. So the last quote: "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the place for a true man is also a prison," right? That's what we just read. Where the state places those who are not with her but against her, it is the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with any honor." That is to say, you don't want to be with the state on these issues. So not everyone agreed, and he was a very influential presence, a vocal presence, and one that's carried through to this civil disobedience and social justice movements of the 20th century. So worth knowing about. But also, he's bailed out by his aunt the next day. He spends exactly one night in jail, which is a testament to his privilege. He is a New England white kid with a Harvard education and really well-to-do friends. But he had that privilege, but it was a privilege that he was conscious of, one that he tried to use to good purpose. Um, then representative in the Senate, Abraham Lincoln also disagreed. So Thoreau was not alone. He wasn't a lone antagonist to this cause. Lincoln also disagreed well before he was president, and he introduced to Congress what were known as spot resolutions. And this is a pretty great moment in history. He stands and he argues it on the floor of Congress. Congress, which, by the way, used to be the most august deliberative body on the planet, and has become, in the last, I don't know how many decades, we'll get there, I'm going to say at least 4 or 5 decades, really, it's not a deliberative body so much as it is a group of folks who really just want to keep their jobs and get reelected. What was once the most august deliberative body on the planet, in that moment, Lincoln stands up and he argues for what he calls spot resolutions. He says, look, show me the spot where the first blood was shed in what became the Mexican-American War. Show me that spot. Show me that it was on U.S. soil, that it was an incursion of a Mexican force onto U.S. soil that shed that first drop of blood. Show me that spot, and I'm down with war. But until you can show me that spot, and show me that it was in fact on U.S. soil, on U.S. territory, which it turns out it wasn't. It was in contested territory, wildly contested territory, and the Mexicans had a slightly better claim to it than the United States. And he says, or cease this war. Congress did not adopt those resolutions, and in fact, Lincoln was mocked pretty roundly for them. And in fact, the general leading the charge, Zachary Taylor, whom we saw, he rode this war right into glory. This will come up in a second. Zachary Taylor rode his war into the glory of the White House, becoming the president, becoming the president in 1849. Right? He died in 1850. It was short-lived, but representative of a model we've seen. We saw it in Jackson, right? Washington was this, Jackson was this. There have been others, but Taylor was one. And it was through his really well-publicized battles in the Mexican-American War that he gained a kind of political power that got him to the White House. Now, speaking of publicized, right, that's where we're at now. And really another thing to know about the Mexican-American War is that it pretty immediately followed a media revolution, a print revolution, where cheap newspapers became readily available for the first time. This was the first war wherein public opinion mattered, because the public had an opinion, because they were keeping up with kind of daily dispatches from the front. They got soldiers' letters, and there were journalists who were paying attention. There was all manner of political cartoons coming out of it, and political portraits, and it helped to sway public opinion. This is the first war in which public opinion really helped to sway events. It was all over the papers, and we will, of course, see much more of that, where public opinion and a mediated response to war does play an oversized role in determining policy, martial policy for the nation. But again, things get more complicated, and we will get there. Next time we will turn, we'll still be with the Mexican-American War, and we will turn to some dissenting voices from within the Mexican and Mexican-American community, and some artistic responses. So I look forward to that.